Hi, thank you everyone for coming. I'm Stephen Buss with YIMBY Neoliberal here in San Francisco, and today we are talking to Emily Hamilton from the Mercatus Institute, or sorry, the Mercatus Center. So Emily is a senior research fellow and the director of the Urbanity Project at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Her research focuses on urban economics and land use policy. And she has authored numerous academic articles and policy papers, and her writings appeared in USA Today, the Washington Post, LA Times, and she also contributes to the blog Market Urbanism. She received her PhD in economics from George Mason University, and today we're going to be talking about the thing that missing middle is missing, which is to say a focus on transit-oriented development. So Emily, let's go over to you. And how about you give us a 1-minute summary of your life and how you got into studying urban economics and land use?
Sure. Thanks so much, Stephen. I have been a city person and a walkable urbanism person since it was possible for me to have feelings on the topic. But I didn't really get into land use policy and hadn't even really thought of land use policy as an issue until I randomly ended up in an internship in the city planning department of my hometown when I was in college. And during that internship, I got really interested in how zoning rules and the approval process shape what's allowed to be built and ultimately what cities look like. And so I came to urban policy from very much the aesthetic urban form side of things, but quickly got very interested in the housing affordability side of these policies and the role that cities play in our economy and society.
Great. And then you just never left, huh? It really sucked you in, huh?
Yes, yeah. Well, I've been working on urban issues as somewhat of a side project for the past 10 years or so, and have been working on urban policy research full time at Mercatus for about 3 years.
That's great. All right, so let's talk about missing middle housing. So again, I'll say for everyone who's just joined, I'm going to run this event talking to Emily, and then when you have questions, please put them into the chat. We'll take them and ask them at the end of the event. But yeah, whenever you think of a question, just drop it in. So let's move on to the big draw, missing middle housing and what it's missing. So for those of you who aren't already aware of what missing middle housing is, it's basically all the housing types between a duplex and like a 10, maybe 15 unit apartment building. It's the middle between a single family home and a skyscraper, right? So typically it's affordable, easily affordable to the middle class. Not always, it depends on the developer, where it is, the particular market in the area, but typically it's where middle class people will live in cities. So first I have to admit, the title of this event, a little bit of a troll. We are, of course, fans of missing middle housing, and Emily, I think you are as well. But I think what you're kind of arguing is that we're leaving some development capacity on the cutting room floor by losing focus on transit-oriented development. Is that right?
Yes, I would say so. And yes, I'm certainly a fan of missing middle housing. I live in missing middle housing and think it plays a really important role in creating housing markets that are broadly affordable to people of a wide range of incomes. And secondly, I support every reform that increases permittable residential density. So whether that's allowing an ADU in a single family neighborhood up to allowing much larger apartment buildings, I think every single reform in that direction is a win. But one thing that I've seen in the focus on missing middle reforms is that the details really matter. So a lot of times missing middle advocates focus on small units within something like the form of an existing single family house. So just basically allowing what's already in a neighborhood to be broken up into smaller units. And in some cases, that works great. If we look at some row house neighborhoods or brownstone neighborhoods with large, very dense units, breaking those up can make a ton of sense and allow individuals or households with multiple people to live in units that were previously only accessible to very wealthy households. But in other cases, if we're thinking about the typical detached US single family house and just breaking that up into multiple units, first off, that might not be something that's economically feasible. That might be worth more in its current form than it would be in a configuration of more smaller units after taking into consideration the cost of that renovation. And additionally, that type of missing middle isn't going to offer all of the benefits of a dense walkable neighborhood that missing middle in somewhere like Brooklyn, for example, might. So I'm absolutely all for missing middle housing, but I think that it can't be the end of the discussion of housing reform. And it may or may not be the best place to start in terms of housing bang for the buck.
Okay, that's interesting clarification. Um, and I realized I told you before this event I wanted to talk also about your Biden administration policy brief, and I skipped right past that. So let me back up real quick. So missing middle is great, and I think the Biden administration released a housing platform, more or less, and you analyzed it and released a housing policy brief on it. And so I'll just give a quick summary for people who haven't read it. So the Biden administration plan basically turns Section 8 from a voucher to an entitlement for all households earning under 50% AMI. So Section 8 is a housing subsidy for people with low incomes. It's currently about, I want to say a quarter of, or maybe a third of all people who qualify are actually able to get it, because it's not, I'm not exactly sure how the funding process works. Maybe I'm sure you do, but basically not everyone who needs it can get it. So it would expand Section 8 to cover everyone who qualifies. And the Biden administration also endorses the Booker-Clyburn Home Act, which ties community development block grants, or CDBGs, and surface transportation block grants to local land use reforms. So basically, it's kind of like a recognition that the feds can't spend their way out of bad local control of zoning. So in my mind, these two things together kind of push cities to start legalizing this missing middle form factor. So so now that I've covered basically what the Biden administration was saying, can you tell us a bit about what you think about their plans and how, what changes you think they should make and how effective you think it'll be for achieving meaningful change and growth in our cities?
Yeah, those are two of the, I'd say, most important pieces of the plan, and the two that I am the most enthusiastic about personally. The expansion of Section 8 recognizes that the lowest income renters in the US are struggling to afford housing and find housing that fits within their budgets, whether regardless of what part of the country they live in, whether they're in a supply constrained market where things may be really dire, or even in a Rust Belt city with a high vacancy rate. These renters generally need income support to afford housing, and particularly housing that meets certain quality standards. So right now, Congress allocates a certain amount of money toward Section 8's housing choice vouchers that then gets divided up among the regions of the country. and then is allocated based on a wait list or a lottery system at the local level to households who qualify based on their income. And it's right now about 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 households who qualify for these vouchers based on their income actually get them. So the Biden plan and proposals by others at HUD and on the Hill would make this an income-based entitlement, meaning that for everyone who qualifies based on their income, they would get these vouchers. And then the tenants would have the option of spending between 30 to 40% of their personal income on housing, and the voucher would cover the rest of their rent up to the amount that's allowed under the voucher program. And I certainly think this is a worthwhile reform, but it's not going to be without costs under the status quo. If we were to expand vouchers to everyone who qualified in San Francisco, for example, it would push affordability problems up the income ladder, probably by increasing rents with this new infusion of money that can be spent on rent. Some of that, and in San Francisco, likely a large portion of that would be captured by landlords. So expanding Section 8 is a great reform for the lowest income households who are suffering the most under current land use policies, but it makes it even more urgent to focus on supply constraints and reforming local zoning and permitting processes to make it feasible to build more housing at lower prices. And that's where the Home Act that you mentioned comes in, the Booker-Clyburn bill that would condition some federal grants on localities making certain reforms that are intended to make more housing, and especially more lower priced housing, feasible, which is basically the only tool that's open to Congress to pursue local zoning reform, is tying incentives based on federal grants to localities making changes to their zoning and permitting processes, which I think is, again, very worthwhile for Congress to do. But it's important to recognize the limits of that approach, and as a result, to design this grant program as well as possible. If we're thinking about some of the very wealthy, most exclusionary jurisdictions in the US, these are probably jurisdictions where these federal grants are much less important to residents and policymakers than they are in lower income, less exclusionary parts of the country. So this program needs to be really designed as effectively as possible to have an effect on the places where we'd like to see it the most. And I think there are some opportunities to do better than what the Home Act currently proposes. First off, I think this federal grant program should go to all permitting jurisdictions and only permitting jurisdictions, whereas CDBG goes to some permitting jurisdictions and not others, and also goes to some counties and states that don't do permitting. And then on the surface transportation block grant side, that program goes from states to localities. So it's, I think, less likely to be effective as compared to a program that goes directly from the federal government to localities.
I'm glad that you mentioned the landlords capturing Section 8 subsidies, because I've always thought that about supply constrained environments, that supply constrained environments, whenever you give a subsidy to something where supply is not growing, you of course have that siphoning off of money into the established, the rent seekers effectively. And so I I certainly agree that zoning reform is an extremely important part of allowing growth, right? So do you think that the CDBGs and the service transportation block grants like would have enough force to actually make cities want to do that? Because, so for example, what I'm thinking of is wealthy communities that don't actually want affordable housing could just, they don't care about CDBGs, right? How do you make those neighborhoods, those communities uh, change their laws?
Yeah, I mean, that's a real limitation of the tools that are available to Congress to encourage local zoning reform. Basically, all they have is using the grants that they provide to localities as a carrot or as a stick to encourage reform. And unfortunately, those sticks or carrots aren't going to be as effective in the places that where reform is most desperately needed. But at the very least, I think it makes sense for Congress to target the correct jurisdictions that have authority over land use planning and permitting with the resources that are available to them. And I'd also like to see Congress focus on housing market outcomes in addition to or instead of choosing from a menu of reforms when localities are working um, on land use reform in order to receive these grants. Because what we've seen is taking ADU ordinances as one example, which are one of the policies that localities can adopt to remain eligible for grants under the Booker-Clyburn proposal. But we've seen plenty of ADU ordinances in the US that aren't resulting in ADUs being built. So if instead Congress focused on allocating grants toward localities that have abundant housing supply, affordable prices, or are at least moving in that direction, I think that could be more effective.
Back to missing middle housing, let's talk about the Tyson's area rezoning. So Tyson's is an area in Virginia that was recently rezoned. It was a big, I guess, kind of commercial area that was somewhat in decline. People were moving out, rents were declining, and the neighborhood or the county wanted to rezone it to incentivize people to move there, to build housing, to increase tax revenue. And you wrote a great piece on it called How a Tyson's Task Force Built a Roadmap for Redevelopment. And I was hoping you could give us just a brief overview of your piece before we dive into the questions.
Sure. Yeah. So to the topic of what's missing from missing middle, Northern Virginia in general has been, and the DC region really more broadly, have been real models in US standards, at least, of excellent transit-oriented development. So the DC region is extremely missing the missing middle, but has done a good job of permitting large apartment buildings near transit. And this really started with Arlington, right across the river from DC in the 1970s, planning for transit-oriented development along the new, at the time, the new Metro Orange line that went out there. And the Arlington County adopted what they call a bullseye approach to planning around the Orange Line Metro stops, permitting dense development of all types, residential as well as office near those metro stations. And it's allowed the county to experience serious population growth while also remaining relatively affordable in terms of high-income coastal jurisdictions in the US. And so much more recently, in 2010, Fairfax County policymakers adopted a plan for Tyson's that was loosely based on the Arlington experience. Tyson's is famous for being an edge city which means a city that's very driving oriented. It's at the intersection of several major arterial roads and freeways. And it's mostly known for some gigantic malls and huge office parks. And so the county policymakers wanted to make Tyson's more competitive with Arlington and DC for commercial tenants by making it more walkable. So reading the Tyson's planning documents is really different than the housing conversations that we're having today that are more focused on housing justice and eliminating single family zoning. Whereas this Tyson's plan is really focused on walkability and changing the aesthetics of the Tyson's environment. But one piece of achieving that walkability and getting the aesthetics that they were looking for was focused on increasing population growth in order to have a more diverse land use that would have people coming and going to Tyson's at all times of day for various purposes. And to create the plan, the Fairfax County Board appointed this task force that you mentioned, Stephen, and tasked them with coming up with a plan for accommodating population growth and development in Tyson. So the county said to the task force, this is your objective. How are we going to get there? Not, should we consider allowing a little bit more housing to be built around the metro stations like Arlington. Tyson's was getting new metro stops and a new metro line that was part of the impetus for the redevelopment planning as well. And so far, about 10 years into the plan, the Tyson's population has a little bit more than doubled, from about 10,000 people to about 25,000 people. And there's been a ton more permitting of multifamily housing than what's reflected in current population numbers. And the county hopes to accommodate a population of 100,000 by 2050 in the Tyson's area.
Wow, 100,000. That's incredible growth. Um, so I know this is spurred by the new line, the new transit line. Was the line planned out ahead of time and then they realized, oh, we need to rezone, or was it all done together? Do you know?
The line was planned ahead of time, and actually the ridership estimates and cost benefit analysis for the line was all based on Fairfax not changing its zoning at all. So it was more a matter of county policymakers wanting to take advantage of the new metro stops and to try to make Tyson's more of a downtown desirable commercial district through the path of increasing residential development there.
Cool. This question, hopefully, I don't know if you know the answer because I didn't think that I was going to ask it, but it occurred to me just now. Do you know the mode share of the people who are moving into this area? Do they primarily use transit, or are the developments also car heavy despite being transit oriented?
I don't have mode share stats at my fingertips, but it is still very much auto oriented. Silver Line is the new metro line that goes through Tyson's. Its ridership is way below what was forecast, even though there's been all this population growth that wasn't planned for in when those forecasts were made. But there are also a lot of people in Tyson's who now have the opportunity to live within walking distance of the offices. That there's also been a ton of new and pre-existing office development in Tyson's. So I would say the mode share is disappointing so far, but certainly taking better advantage of the accessibility to jobs as well as transit than it was previously.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I guess it takes people some time to change their habits, and the more density will, further incentivize more transit and walkability. In the Tyson's plan, I'm not too familiar with the particular rezoning. Was it all for very high density things that we would not classify missing middle, or was there some high rises, some missing middle in there as well?
It's all for density that I would say is more dense than missing middle, but there is some mixture with the densest development being permitted within an eighth of a mile of the new metro stations, with a little bit lower rise density being permitted a little farther away.
Okay, all right, cool. And so to go back to our intentionally somewhat controversial topic title for the event, one of the arguments that NIMBYs typically make against missing middle housing is a lack of parking, or too much traffic, or that indeed the missing middle housing that might be rezoned for their neighborhood would be better situated near existing transit lines. And so um, how might we counter that? Or does the Tyson's redevelopment give us any lessons for that? Or do you have suggestions for how we can change missing middle policies to pull in the very best parts of transit-oriented development?
Yeah, well, I would refer to Arlington instead of Tyson's for lessons on traffic and transit-oriented development. Arlington has actually seen declining traffic on the county's major arterials since the 1990s, in spite of lots of population growth since then, because so many new residents to Arlington either don't have a car at all or don't use it to commute to their jobs. They instead either are able to walk or bike to work within Arlington, or they're taking the Orange Line, or the Blue Line in South Arlington to their jobs in DC or wherever they may be. So Arlington's really achieved that, I think, goal of transit-oriented development, of allowing growth without making traffic worse. Whether missing middle can achieve that same goal, I think really depends on the specific form of missing middle that we're talking about. Certainly, if we're thinking of Brownstone, Brooklyn, that's an extremely transit-oriented form of development that's very walkable, very complementary of a low driving share and a high transit share of commuting. But if we're talking about taking, say, half-acre lots in a subdivision and allowing 2 or 4 units on those, I'm not sure that there's going to be a meaningful difference in mode share or the ease of using transit or walking in those neighborhoods. But one thing that's really important for making missing middle as transit friendly as possible is eliminating parking requirements, and at least creating the conditions where people aren't required to pay for parking spaces that they might not need in missing middle neighborhoods, and discouraging um, new residents from having as many cars as they otherwise might.
For sure. Yeah, that reminds me of both Houston and Los Angeles, where, I mean, if you look at Los Angeles, basically the entire city is what we would call missing middle. There, courtyard. What are those called? Uh, small quadplexes with a shared courtyard.
Hmm.
But everyone in LA drives. The zoning is exclusionary, so you can't have corner stores in your neighborhoods, and so and of course, Houston has famously had no zoning except for parking minimums, and of course whatever the neighborhoods lay on top with their uh, like the neighborhood association, if I understand correctly, can do its own kind of zoning layer.
Hmm.
So has uh, if I'm remembering correctly, didn't Did Houston recently repeal their parking minimum laws, or is that still in effect?
Houston got rid of parking requirements in at least two, maybe a couple more neighborhoods that are close into downtown within their I-610 loop, but still has very high LA level parking requirements for most of the city.
Okay, okay, interesting, interesting. Um, do you have any information on how those neighborhoods are adjusting to no longer having parking minimums, or is it too soon to tell?
I think it may be too soon to tell, or at least I'm not familiar with new developments that are taking advantage of being allowed to provide as much parking as they like rather than meeting the parking requirements. Houston did do a minimum lot size reform from 5,000 square feet down to 1,400 square feet,
Wow.
first within their inner loop in the late 90s, and then more recently across the whole city. And that has had really clear impacts on townhouse construction, with essentially 3 townhouses being allowed to replace a single family house on a 5,000 square lot. And there's tons of them that you can see in lots of different parts of the city.
Awesome. So with that knowledge that we're gaining from these experiments, both Tyson's and Houston, do you think that there are certain areas where missing middle like really is the best option for increasing density uh, over transit-oriented development? And maybe conversely, which which places do you think the push for missing middle is like less suited for, either politically or economically or whatever criteria you might want to choose?
Yeah, so I think this is a maybe an unanswerable question in a lot of cases. But to take the Arlington example again, in Northern Virginia, transit-oriented development has been very successful. But if you go just a couple of blocks away from the transit corridors in the county, then you're in a low density single family neighborhood where nothing more dense is permitted. So in a place like that, there certainly remain opportunities for more high-rise transit-oriented development in Arlington, but the missing middle is glaring, and I think it makes a ton of sense to allow small lot townhouses at the very least across the entire county. When we're talking about other places where there's a lack of, say, both transit-oriented development and missing middle, I think it really depends on the politics and what is the lower hanging fruit. In the Tyson's example, the landowners, the office parks, the retail, and everyone whose land was getting drastically upzoned were unsurprisingly way behind this plan, and saw it as saw that it would be a huge financial windfall for them to get these additional development rights. In single family neighborhoods, if there are homeowners, at least some portion of homeowners who are on board with the reform, then the politics might work. Like some of the successful examples we've seen in Houston or Minneapolis or California. But if homeowners prove to be too much of an obstacle to reform, then upzoning on commercial land, whether that's office parks or retail corridors, what have you, might be a more politically feasible option. And certainly, I would like to see apartment residents have the option of living on a commercial corridor or in a quieter neighborhood of their choice. But just thinking about what's politically feasible, in some cases, I think it may be reforming land use for those commercial zones.
Yeah, that's a lot of the pressure we see in San Francisco, at least. When the local city council wants to introduce any kind of reform, it's typically reserved, the proposal will start out as like, oh, we'll do it just along commercial corridors, which I think, it's a nice step, but it also, of course, means that people in apartments will live on the highest traffic streets with the most pollution and the most noise, and the single family homeowners get to keep their quiet neighborhood. So it's definitely, yeah, the political reality makes any of these changes just so impossibly hard, which I actually found interesting about Tyson's. In your article, you said that the Tyson's rezoning was interesting because the people in the wealthy neighborhoods that bordered the Tyson's area kind of had more say in what happened there, and so they were given this, uh, you know, guide of, it's going to happen. So how do you want it to happen such that it impacts you the least? So you kind of they kind of tapped into the wealthy people's selfishness to get maximum density at Tyson's. And I wonder, have you seen similar things elsewhere? Because that's the first, I mean, it's one of the first projects where I've heard that kind of alignment of incentives.
Yeah, I can't think of other examples that are exactly comparable to that. But the chairman of the Tyson's task force that helped create the plan framed it as, this plan was feasible because Tyson's wasn't anyone's backyard at the time. It was this very commercial, kind of crossroads area that had a very small population of its own. And so the NIMBYism that would typically stand in the way of allowing for something like Tyson's level redevelopment in other suburban jurisdictions was really minimized there. And you're right that the homeowners in surrounding communities that were not being directly affected by the upzoning were really focused on minimizing traffic that would be going through their neighborhoods from new Tyson's residents. And they were really focused on public services that would be located in Tyson's for Tyson's residents. Kind of the weirdest to me aspect of the Tyson's redevelopment was this huge focus on parks, and residents in other parts of Fairfax County were really focused on Tyson's having so many parks and athletic fields that Tyson's residents wouldn't be going to other parts of the county to use their parks. It's really the first extreme example of park NIMBYism like that I've seen.
Incredible. Gosh. Okay, great. So by the way, for people who have joined since we've gotten started, we are going to move into the Q&A section soon. So if you have questions, please just drop it into the chat, and we'll ask them at the end. But I have maybe one or two more questions for Emily, and then we'll get to Q&A. So one reason that many support missing middle housing over high density projects is the perception that they tend to be less expensive than large towers and therefore more suitable for middle income residents. Is that true? I mean, I guess I can see it being true for like a 3/1 or 4/1 where it's wood frame over a concrete podium. That's a pretty cheap kind of building to construct, although maybe not right now because there's apparently a lumber shortage and prices have gone insane. But like, if you're comparing that, your modest 4 or 5 story building wood frame to a 40-story, 50-story high rise, is the outcome per unit going to be drastically different? Do you even have numbers on this? I'm not sure.
I don't have complete numbers on that. The numbers that are pretty readily accessible are construction costs. And it's certainly true that a 4 or 5/1 is less expensive on a per square foot basis to build than a 40-story building. And going further down the size scale, a 3 or 4 story walk up is likewise significantly less expensive to build per square foot than a 5/1. But when you're factoring in the economies of scale and some of the fixed costs, like the time and effort of getting a permit for a project, I think that somewhat reduces the cost effectiveness of missing middle relative um, to a higher density construction.
That's interesting. So in that sense, it's almost like missing middle is more of a aesthetic argument rather than an economic one. I mean, maybe not all the time, but do you get that impression?
Yes, yeah, certainly. I think some of the biggest missing middle cheerleaders are very focused on what they like about the aesthetics of missing middle. And if we were to look historically at, say, triple deckers in New England, or um, missing middle in the outer boroughs of New York City, or row houses in Baltimore, certainly those at the time they were built were a housing typology that was affordable to middle income or lower income residents. But the development environment is so different today, in terms of what makes up the costs of development, as well as some of the difficulties of getting these projects approved, that I don't think current missing middle can be expected to be as affordable relative to current incomes as it was historically.
Wow, that's quite a last statement. I was going to leave it there, but gosh, I don't know. How I feel like that deserves a follow-up question. So if it's maybe not true, like affordable compared to historic triple deckers and Richmond specials, that what does that mean for the future of our housing markets? Like, what, I mean, obviously everything is broken everywhere, but what should we do? What's like what? Yeah, where do we go from here?
Well, permitting missing middle or something like Houston townhouses is certainly a step toward allowing more housing to be built and more supply at the regional level. I certainly think will have a good effect on housing affordability. But if we're looking at some of the places where new construction duplexes, for example, in high cost localities are getting built, it's just not reasonable to expect those to be immediately affordable to a median income household, for example.
Yeah, that makes sense. I agree with that. And it's indeed one of the reasons that I am such a big fan of very high density development in high demand places like, San Francisco, where it's still, our height limits are still 4 stories in pretty much the entire city. Um, Great. Thank you, Emily. This was really wonderful. I really love your coverage on all of these topics and the analysis that you constantly put out. She's a great follow on Twitter, by the way. If you're on Twitter, she's EBW. What's your Twitter handle?
EBW Hamilton.
EBW Hamilton. Great.
Thanks so
Um,
much, Stephen.
Absolutely. And so let's move on to the Q&A. So we've got 4 questions lined up, maybe 5. Oh yeah, I agree. Sabik, Emily, you deserve the Chief Shill Award. Instead, we got a streamer, a Twitch streamer. That's okay. Bastiat, he's a good guy.
Yes, he is.
All right, so Q&A. So this one I think was from Zach Subin at the beginning. Is it fair to think that missing middle and transit-oriented are complementary in that missing middle and ending exclusionary zoning is more critical for equity goals and transit-oriented is more critical for climate goals? Or is this too simple of a dichotomy?
I'm not sure that I would necessarily split them up in terms of one being having an equity objective and one having a climate objective. I think they can both improve things on both margins, but I absolutely think they are complementary. If we were to look at US cities prior to zoning, for example, we would see tons of denser than missing middle development, and also tons of missing middle. Or looking at somewhere like Tokyo today, that's a model of affordability. There's tons of missing middle there. But I think it's perhaps difficult to prioritize both of them at the same time from an activist perspective, although not necessarily. Thinking of the Minneapolis 2040 plan, the triplex reform got all of the attention, but it also had lots of reforms for higher density development on some of Minneapolis's corridors. So I certainly don't think it needs to be one or the other. And if activists and policymakers in a locality can work on both at the same time, then that's fantastic.
Yeah, that makes sense. I love that you brought up Tokyo, because most people, when they think of Tokyo, they think of this super high density, gleaming metropolis. But in fact, the vast majority of Tokyo is missing middle, 2 and 3 story
Yeah.
buildings that they don't have parking. They're near train stations. Everything is walkable. It's lovely. It's really one of the most lovely places on earth. I know we all stand Tokyo too much in the urbanist world, but it's really quite lovely. So that question was from Zach Subin. He's the lead organizer for urban environmentalists here in San Francisco, part of UMB Action. So he's always thinking about how housing relates to climate and our goals to keep the planet habitable. If I think if you live in San Francisco, consider joining urban environmentalists. They're actually, where it doesn't matter where you live. Look up urban environmentalists. They're a great group to follow. Okay, number 2, we'll go to, this one's about parking minimums. So can you expand on how reducing parking minimums helps with transit-oriented developments? So there's more here. In some parts of coastal California, the state's reluctant to eliminate parking because the fear of it would increase on-street parking congestion, and that would impact visitor access to the coast. So what are some solutions to increase the effectiveness of TOD, that would address that concern? Because of course most of California is inaccessible by transit.
Yeah, that's a great question. And basically everything I have to say about parking I got from Donald Shoup and his work generally, and especially the book, The High Cost of Free Parking. And I don't think that reducing or eliminating off-street parking requirements can be done successfully without at the same time better managing on-street parking. And the way to manage demand for on-street parking is to price it appropriately, whether that's with meters, especially for coastal access, that would work very easily to just meter that parking at rates that are high enough to keep some availability of spots open at all times. And then in lower density or residential areas, pricing residential parking permits high enough so that you don't get more people trying to park on neighborhood streets than there are available. So I think that they either need to come at the same time, or the management of on-street parking needs to come before getting rid of off-street parking requirements.
That's interesting. Do you think that makes it politically easier if people know that they'll have access to parking before any changes happen? Like if they can just buy their permit?
Potentially. I think drivers are also like really averse to paying more for the cost of storing their car, even though sometimes they're storing their car on incredibly valuable real estate at little or no cost to them. But I think that oftentimes things like appropriately metering parking or implementing tolls on roads is fought tooth and nail when it's proposed, and then once it comes to being implemented, drivers don't have as big of a problem with it as they thought that they would.
Yeah, totally. All right, moving on to question number 3. This one's from, gosh, Anil. I think, I don't, maybe I'm saying that correctly. Anil Odisho. They ask, do you believe the public health and wellness aspects of urbanism and housing are under discussed? And how can we justify adding denser housing and transit?
Yeah, I do. I certainly think there are public health benefits for people incorporating walking into their daily lives, whether that's walking to transit to get to work or walking to meet up with friends or run errands. I think that's certainly, this is not my area of expertise by any stretch, but certainly a win for public health and getting people moving more in the natural course of their day. And another thing that I think is very under discussed in terms of public health and housing is the quality issues in some of the older housing stock that we have in many of our high cost cities, from lead paint to mold to inefficient utilities. These are all serious public health concerns that are at times basically impossible to address because of rules like historic preservation that prevent these problems from getting better over time.
Absolutely. That concern about health of the environmental health of an existing building, it really came to a head last year in San Francisco when California had all the fires. And myself and many of my friends live in, at the time I was living in a 100-plus-year-old building, and the facade was historic and the windows didn't close right. And, smoke was just inside my apartment at like toxic levels. And so
Yeah.
it's a really important health goal to modernize our housing stock and to like actually encourage it and let it happen. I'll follow up with that question again. They just posted in the chat. They meant to say, how do you think we can emphasize those public health benefits? I'm wondering, are you asking emphasize it to the public, like pitching it to make it an easier sell, or emphasizing like making the new buildings more safe? Okay, the first one. So how do we pitch it to the public, pitching the health benefits?
I'm not sure I have any good advice on that one. Aside from maybe using that in your own housing advocacy, or writing op-eds or letters to the editor that put those public health issues forward. There are certainly news hooks all the time that make that issue relevant. Stephen's example of the fires, or children with lead levels in their blood that are too high. I think these are really salient issues to people regardless of their stance on housing policies. So certainly drawing attention to them is, I think, worthwhile.
Absolutely. And in addition to that, I like to highlight how the majority of the old housing stock is not ADA compliant. So people with disabilities are, their options are really limited. But in new buildings that meet all the standards, not only is it higher quality housing, but it's housing they can actually use in ways that they need. Thank you for the question, and thank you, Emily, for that answer. Moving on, we've got a couple more questions left. So someone asks, is there a kind or form of housing that is most cost effective per unit?
Well, I think it really depends on the specific situation, what the land costs are, and what the construction costs are in a specific example. But in general, the higher the land costs, you're going to get to a point where a high rise is going to be the most cost effective type of housing, because you're taking that very expensive piece of land and sharing that cost across a lot of households. But the lower the land costs, the more that something like a mid-rise 5/1 or a true missing middle becomes the most affordable option. So ideally, I would love to see cities where density follows land prices. So we get those super high density, high rise housing developments in the most prime downtown desirable neighborhoods, falling off toward mid rise and then missing middle construction in places where that is able to take advantage of somewhat lower land prices.
I love that idea, and I've heard about that before, but I'm wondering, do you have anything? Uh, is there a really good source on reading about like automatic rezonings based on land values? And Joe, I'm going to get to Georgism later. We'll get there.
Well, Dan Keshet and Chris Bradford in Austin came up with a proposal for rezonings based on when land value per unit of housing reaches a certain level. It hasn't been implemented anywhere. It's just a policy idea for right now, but I think that's a great proposal for folks to check out.
Great. I'm wondering, I'm dropping a link into the chat, and maybe that might be what you're.
Yes, yeah.
Awesome. Great. I'm definitely going to read that. Thank you. Okay. Next question. This one's interesting. So this is California. The next question is California. Well, I guess it's not California specific, but it was recently a topic of policy concern. So recent efforts to rezone the state with Senate bills. So that's SB 827 and SB 50 for all the nerds in the chat. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it's basically that was transit-oriented development rezoning. So allowing higher density near existing high quality transit lines. The problem is that in much of California, and I think indeed much of the United States, that there is a really big overlap between transit adjacent neighborhoods and historically disadvantaged neighborhoods, right? Because the rich neighborhoods don't have transit, so they're unaffected by these kinds of rezonings, and the more poor neighborhoods, the working class neighborhoods, get upzoned. And in California, the conversation was like, this is inequitable because you're letting the rich people who are hoarding opportunities off the hook. What do you think? Like, how should we respond to that? Is there a good policy solution, or is this something that we just have to? I mean, I don't know. What's your take?
Well, if we look at very liberally regulated land use markets, either today or historically, we see development going to a high priced, high demand locations relative to more affordable locations, which has its own costs. I mean, if we were to look at parts of the country where supply constraints aren't a huge concern, we're concerned instead about disinvestment in those neighborhoods that are currently the most affordable. So I think those concerns should be balanced. But my view is that in a place like California, if you upzone enough, which I think SB 827 would have, you're going to open up enough opportunities for development in high price, high income, high demand locations that it's going to take a lot of development pressure off of lower income, perhaps less politically well-connected neighborhoods as a result. So I think upzoning sufficiently is the best way to avoid or at least minimize displacement in lower income neighborhoods, whether that's through something like a statewide single family preemption bill or something that's more focused on transit oriented development.
Great. Yeah, I agree. Okay, Joe, we've gotten to it. Emily, what are your thoughts on land value tax and or Georgism?
Well, I'm certainly see a lot to like in a land value tax. As far as Georgism more broadly, I think he was a little bit overly pessimistic about the state of things without a land value tax. Obviously, things have improved tremendously for middle and lower income Americans in spite of not having a land value tax. So we don't run into Malthusianism without a land value tax. But I think it certainly makes a ton of sense from both a policy, a general fiscal policy perspective and a land development perspective to tax land based on its value rather than taxing structures. My concern with a land value tax right now is that if we were to pass, say, a nationwide land value tax, I think that would give huge ammunition to homeowners who don't want to see upzoning, because if you create this new tax that's going to increase their tax burden if their homes are upzoned, I think that's going to be really alarming to people, and we'll get a ton of sympathy, and perhaps rightly so. So I think it's really important to get rid of rules like residential density restrictions before implementing a land value tax rather than the other way around.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, we are now on to our last question. So if anyone wants to get one in before the end, now is your chance. So last question is, what research are you looking forward to in the coming months or years? Like, what are the biggest gaps in our knowledge about how housing works that you'd like to see resolved? Or any interesting land use experiments that are happening in the United States?
Yeah, in my current research, I am focused on looking at the causal effects of different types of upzoning. I'm doing some research right now on Houston's minimum lot size reform that I talked about earlier, as well as a statewide ADU law in Vermont. And basically, my hope with my own research, and something that I love seeing in other people's research, is learning about exactly what we can expect from land use reforms and what makes land use reforms successful in terms of actually allowing lots more housing to be built in the places where people want to live and improving housing affordability.
Great. Okay, so thank you again to Emily Hamilton. This is a wonderful event. I really love hearing your takes on land use development, and I just want to thank you again for your time, for answering all these questions. Thank you for all the attendees for the interesting questions. And before we disconnect, I want to plug, we have a Clubhouse event coming up next week called What is Centrist YIMBYism, with 3 different guests. I am blanking on their names. I'm sorry. All of one of our other organizers here in San Francisco is putting on this event. I dropped the link into the chat. Feel free to add it to your calendar. It should be an interesting chat. It's next Thursday at, I think, 6 p.m. Pacific. And I think that's it. So what we're going to do, I'm going to stop the recording, and then I'm going to ask about the container ship. All right.
Thanks so much, Stephen, and thanks everyone for the great questions.